Here is the appropriation of the Pysanka and its roots in Ukrainian culture. To begin, a brief history. Now, the word Pysanka is originally derived from the Ukrainian verb pyatsy, which means to write or to inscribe. This tradition dates back to the pre-Christian era. The decoration and the culture surrounding the eggs don't and didn't really coincide with the Christian beliefs. Now, the ritual itself is an offering and a prayer to the gods, specifically the sun god. The Ukrainians would ask for peace, prosperity, health, any wishes for the coming year. Now, the legend of the Pysanky, the sun god was viewed as the one god in Ukrainian culture. He was the all powerful and the most important figure because he was the source of all life on Earth. It is believed that the birds were the sun god's messengers since they were the only ones who could get close to him. And so the humans had decided to try and catch birds in order to deliver a message or to learn more about the sun god. Now, when they found out that it wasn't so easy to catch a bird mid-flight, they began to take the bird's eggs. Now, the eggs were honored in spring festivals because they were a representation of winter ending, new life beginning, and, of course, the sun god. Now, many Ukrainians believed that the balance of the world entirely depended on the Pysanky. As long as the ritual would continue, the earth would survive. But if the tradition were ever abandoned, this is a legend. Actually, my grandmother taught me when I was young. There is an evil spirit in the shape of a serpent, and it's believed to be Satan, and he is chained to the side of a cliff. Now, if he were to escape his shackles or to loosen them, he would wreak havoc on the earth. Every year, the serpent would send his minions into the world. If the number of Pysanky were high, then he would remain shackled, and they would even tighten up. But if the number of Pysanky began to drop, then the chains would loosen, and the spirit would be able to wreak havoc on the living world. Now, making a Pysanky. In its origin, the Pysanky were created by the women of the family. When the children went to bed, the women would recite their prayers and begin the creation. Now, this was a ritual that was passed down from grandmother to mother to daughter. It stayed in the females of the family, and it was further passed on for generations. Now, the eggs themselves are created, of course, once one gathers eggs. In a bowl, beeswax is heated up, usually on the main home stove, and the women would dip a stylus into the beeswax and begin to apply it to the egg. It was one sort of continuous motion, and they would wrap it all the way around. Now, a quick break from the Pysanky to discuss cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation. Cultural appropriation is the act of taking a practice or belief from one's culture, which is not your own, and using it for personal gain. Now, this implies that someone who is appropriating a culture does not understand the meaning behind such practices and are uneducated in the culture itself. For example, in our discussion board, I discussed the indigenous headdress. Now, we all know it was a common costume back in the day, and that's because no one was educated as to what it really meant, and I'm sure some of the time they did, but most of the time they didn't realize why it was seen as so disrespectful. Cultural appreciation, on the other hand, is a mutual learning experience of another culture, to learn and promote one's culture in an educational way that shows respect. Typically, appreciation includes the sharing of two parties' respected culture, so learning about one culture in exchange for information about your own in a respectful setting. The very first appropriation of Pysanky came when the Christians and Christianity began to spread their religious beliefs. They were first appropriated by the Christians as an act of religious syncretism. So, of course, the Christians just wanted everyone to conform to their beliefs. Now, when they saw the Pysanky and the ritual itself and how important it was to the Ukrainian people, they began to shape the tradition in their own way. So there are a ton of symbols and symbolism involved in the Pysanky, and each one means a different thing. Each one represents something new and something important to the Ukrainian people. When the Christians began to adapt this tradition, they made a lot of disrespectful changes at the time. For example, the triangle, which at first was used to represent the elements of earth, fire, and air, was then altered to represent the Christians' Holy Trinity. The cross, which at first represented the rising sun in respect to the sun god, was altered to represent Christ and the cross, the Christian cross, that is. And the stars and sun that were seen as offerings to the sun god and a representation of how important that he was to the Ukrainian people was now altered to represent the Christians' one god. As for the second appropriation of Pysanky, when Ukrainian immigrants began to immigrate to North and South America, they, of course, brought their beliefs and tradition with them. Now, at this time, due to the Soviet regime, the Ukraine was not allowed to produce these eggs and these traditions anymore. So, of course, when immigrating, they wanted to bring it with them. At first, the practice was respected and upheld, but soon other cultures began to modify the eggs. They weren't educated as to how important the symbolism was and exactly what the ritual meant. Now, instead of inscribing Ukrainian symbols or using the required colors, the Americans began to decorate the eggs for the visual effect instead of the spiritual, which has come to be the eggs that we all recognize today around Easter time. And they replaced the traditional symbols with that of their own beliefs and began using bright, attractive colors and design solely for the visual aspect. Now, of course, I would consider the first appropriation of Pysanky the most upsetting. The Christian culture began to strip the egg of its original meaning and replace it with their own beliefs. So, of course, over time, some of the symbolism and importance of it was not able to be passed down to Ukrainian generations. It was incredibly upsetting at the time because, of course, they were having this tradition and this communication with who they believed their one true God to be, being taken away and now being used to honor someone else's God, which incredibly disrespectful at the time, of course. As for the second appropriation, however, there was substantially less outrage. At this point in time, as I mentioned, the Ukrainians had immigrated, and in Ukraine, the tradition was done in secrecy, and there were severe punishments if Ukrainians were caught taking part in the tradition. Ukrainians at the time were just happy to see the tradition live on and to pass it on to new people and hopefully spread the word. And as I mentioned earlier with the legend of the serpent, they were happy because even though it wasn't exactly in the way that they had learned or been brought up to decorate the eggs, there were still Pysanky in the world, and so the evil spirit would remain shackled to his mountain. As for my belief and the further appreciation of the tradition, I hold no hard feelings towards the second appropriation. It was a tradition for Ukrainian people that had began to dissolve as they were having it stripped away from them in their own homes. I created Pysanky with my grandma when I was young, my baba from Ukrainian descent, and we had decided to take a more modern turn on them with the new colors and promoting that creativity, and not so much sticking to what they were originally. And now, in today's day and age, it's very popular to paint eggs at Easter, and for me, I see that as an appreciation of it. Although not everyone knows where the tradition stems from originally, it's still upheld, and it's still a very big source of joy for a lot of families around Easter time. I enjoy to see these new designs, and with coming ages, people are getting more creative and really taking it up a step. There's some funny and very creative eggs that I feel should be celebrated, and that's all. That was the brief history and the appropriation of the Pysanky.